Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Tip of the Iceberg Live, brought to you as always by InsideThePenguins.com, a proud affiliate of the Hockey News. We got a fun show for you guys today, talking a little bit about the draft lottery that's coming up here in just about 2.5 hours. We'll discuss the Hart finalists being announced earlier today by the NHL, and then we'll talk a little bit about the IIHF World Championships, which are slated to begin on Friday, before answering, of course, all of your questions. Let's start things off, though, with the draft lottery. Coming up in 2.5 hours, we talked about it earlier today on the Tip of the Iceberg podcast. Not a lot doing for the Pittsburgh Penguins. They got a 1.5% chance to move from 14th overall to 4th overall in the NHL draft odds. And if they don't do that, then they will be forfeiting their first round pick to the San Jose Sharks as the conclusion of the Erik Karlsson trade. So that's really all they have to look for tonight. They can get back into the first round if the Carolina Hurricanes make it all the way to the Stanley Cup final. They'll get the Hurricanes 31st or 32nd overall pick if that happens. But outside of that, not a lot going on for the Penguins as far as the NHL draft is concerned, especially in the first round. So we'll keep an eye on what happens tonight. John Buccigross may or may not have spoiled the actual results of that. If you saw his tweet that has been deleted since then, it looks like an interesting team will be taking 2nd overall. And that is, if it happens, I wouldn't mind seeing it. But at the same time, I'm not sure a lot of people would like to see the Utah Hockey Club, whatever they end up calling themselves, moving up after just moving to Utah 3 weeks ago. But I digress on that point. Not a lot going outside of that for the NHL draft lottery and the Pittsburgh Penguins. Another thing that was announced today, the Hart finalists for the 2023-24 season, Sidney Crosby not among the top 3. I would assume he ends up getting a handful of votes. I would assume he might even get a handful of first place votes, but he is not in the top 3. Those finalists are Connor McDavid, Nathan MacKinnon, and Nikita Kucherov. Austin Matthews doesn't get to 70 goals, and he doesn't get into the top 3 finalists of the Hart Trophy. That just makes all the sense in the world. So it goes to the 3 players that were duking it out for the Art Ross Trophy, McDavid, MacKinnon, and Kucherov. And if I had to put my money down on one of them, it feels like it's going to be Nikita Kucherov's year once again. When you look at the team around each of these players, I mean, there's a lot of talent for all of them, but the discrepancy between Kucherov and second place on his team in points and the ability to just drag the Tampa Bay Lightning into the playoffs, they looked like a much better team than they were at the end of the regular season simply because of the brilliance of Nikita Kucherov. But I'm not going to get too much deeper into that. That's just the news and notes of the day around the National Hockey League. Let's talk a little bit about the World Championships. A lot of Penguins representation heading over to Czechia for that tournament starting on Friday. The latest additions were Jesse Puljujärvi and Valtteri Puustinen named to Team Finland. They're going to join former Penguins Juuso Riikola, Olli Maatta, and Mikael Granlund for Team Finland. So it's going to be an interesting unit over there. I'm interested to see who Valtteri Puustinen plays with. We're going to talk a little bit later about what this could mean for Puustinen and how big of an opportunity is for him to not just represent his country at the World Championships for the 2nd time in his career, but to really make a statement and follow in the footsteps of another Penguin that parlayed a World Championship performance into a breakout season with the Pittsburgh Penguins. So we'll talk about that here in just a couple of minutes. But the other Penguins that are heading over to Czechia this week, Marcus Pettersson and Erik Karlsson for Team Sweden. That much has been known for a very long time. Michael Bunting will be heading over for Team Canada. Ravis Ansons will be heading over for Team Latvia, Penguins prospect. And then, of course, Kyle Dubas as AGM of Team Canada and Ty Hennes as an assistant coach for Team USA. One player not on that list, Sidney Crosby. There was some discussion as to whether or not Crosby would join Team Canada for the World Championships, maybe as a primer for the Four Nations face-off coming up in 25, and then also for the 2026 Winter Olympics over in Italy. He decides not to. He decides that he's going to take this time to continue to play some golf, rest up, and stay off the ice, at least in official capacity. So it's interesting that, a lot of people were having the discussion about he has to do it to get back in the good graces or to really set up some good graces between he and Team Canada. I don't think that's going to be an issue. I said it all along. I don't think that if 2025 comes around and they're looking for a Four Nations face-off team, I don't think there's going to be any animosity between Crosby and Team Canada. And if there is, then those folks up north are just, you know, I don't know what to say other than they just have no idea what they're doing if they end up breaking and not utilizing Sidney Crosby for Four Nations face-off and for the Olympics just because he didn't want to go to the World Championships the 2 years of his career that he was actually eligible for them. So a lot of Penguins players heading over. We'll be interested to see who performs well, who can carry their team perhaps to a medal in the next couple of weeks here. But the biggest one I want to talk about, the biggest opportunity for the Penguins over in Czechia belongs to Valtteri Puustinen. Puustinen coming off of his first real big opportunity at the National Hockey League level, playing 52 games this year, scoring 20 points, 5 of them being goals, 15 being assists, but 18 of his 20 points at even strength. It was on and off for Puustinen. When he initially came up to the National Hockey League level this season, he was performing very, very well on the top 6 with Crosby and Malkin. And then as the season went on, he went into a little bit of a struggle, and then they put him in the bottom 6 to end the season. Now, he did find a place down there. Him, Lars Eller, and Riley Smith did have some really good games towards the end of the season, helping the Penguins with a little bit of depth as they pushed towards the playoff. But at the end of the day, it was an uneven season for Valtteri Puustinen. A decent first look at the National Hockey League as an extended look with 52 games now under his belt after this year. This is going to be his second chance at the IIHF World Championships. The last time he was in it was after the 2021 season. He had 0 points in 2 games played for Team Finland. The Penguins would love to have a guy in Valtteri Puustinen develop into a top 6 winger. And this is going to be a really big opportunity for him to showcase that he could potentially push for one of those positions next season. Because if you look at the Penguins' top 6 right now, Crosby, Malkin, it's going to be your 1A, 1B, first line center, second line center. Brian Rust, immovable. He's not going anywhere. That's 3 down. Michael Bunting going over for Team Canada, like I mentioned, pretty much immovable. He's going to be on Malkin's wing to start next season. You would have to assume. That leaves 2 spots open. Rickard Rakell, Riley Smith, their future is kind of up in the air. Drew O'Connor is coming back, but I think we can all agree that even though O'Connor looked great as a top 6 winger this season, he might be best served as a third liner, taking advantage of some matchups where he can outperform other players and he could potentially give the Penguins that scoring depth that they have been looking for the past couple of seasons. So that leaves an opportunity there for Puustinen. He could also be a bottom 6 scoring depth type of player, but he has the tools to be a top 6 winger in the National Hockey League. He has a fantastic shot, was rarely able to use it during this season, and he has really solid instincts, something that served him well at certain points, but he just needs to learn a little bit more how to get into that open space. You saw it a couple of different times. He got opportunities. Some of those opportunities, he just wasn't able to hit the mark. That's going to be something that comes with time and comes with experience at the National Hockey League level. But could this be, this tournament, his first step towards breaking out next season? We saw it with Drew O'Connor this past year, right? The 2023 World Championships, Drew O'Connor went over and he had himself a really good tournament. He played center, in fact, having a really good tournament for Team USA last year. He parlayed that into a solid training camp, and he parlayed that into his first full season at the National Hockey League level and becoming this guy we're talking about now as a top 6 player that, yes, it would be really nice if the Penguins could utilize him in the bottom 6, but at the end of the day, nobody's going to complain about Drew O'Connor in the top 6 because he showed to be able to handle that responsibility. And it all started last year at the World Championships. Is that this year's iteration of Valtteri Puustinen? Can he go out there and impress this summer, take the summer to also build off of that, and then go into training camp next year and earn that spot alongside maybe a Sidney Crosby, maybe an Evgeny Malkin? If we're looking at what the top 6 looks like right now, I think a first line, again, if he takes those steps forward, a first line of Sidney Crosby, Brian Rust, and Valtteri Puustinen would be very interesting. Now, the question becomes is Puustinen going to be able to bring up the forechecking? Is he going to be able to finish the opportunities that Sidney Crosby gets on his stick? That's going to be the biggest question, and that's going to be the determining factor as to whether or not he's able to stick in the top 6 for a long time. He got those cups of coffee there this season. He looked pretty good. He looked like he belonged, but there's still steps that need to be taken by the former 7th-round pick of the Penguins a couple seasons ago. So is this the biggest opportunity? Maybe not the biggest. It would have been probably a playoff opportunity if the Penguins were able to get in. But this is a massive chance for Valtteri Puustinen on a world stage to prove that he is taking steps forward, to prove that he belongs at that stage, especially on a team that does not have a lot of NHL talent. I know I mentioned Juuso Riikola, former NHLer for the Pittsburgh Penguins. I mentioned Mikael Granlund, who's coming off of a stellar season with the San Jose Sharks. I mentioned Mata, who's going to be on the back end. We talked about Jesse Puljujärvi. I wonder if those two end up playing together. That would certainly be interesting because they could make up 2/3 of the third line going into next season for the Penguins. But outside of those players, there's not a whole lot of NHL talent. So Puustinen might get an opportunity to not only play at this world stage, but to be a top 6 player, to be a first power play player. And if he can thrive in that role, the Penguins, I'm certain, will look at that and utilize that to place him a little bit higher starting next year in training camp. So this is going to be a fun tournament to watch. A lot of Penguins representation. There was some last year, Casey DeSmith. We talked a little bit about, Drew O'Connor earlier, but a lot of players on a lot of different teams here. What's Carlson going to look like for Team Sweden? That much I want to see because, this is a tournament where superstars can really, put their will and inflict their will upon the rest of the tournament. Is Carlson going to be able to do that? Because he didn't do that at points this year for the Pittsburgh Penguins. They would certainly like to see him pick that up and pick up the pace at the World Championship level. But we've been going on a little bit. Not a lot of news going on around the National Hockey League. I see a couple of people are here in the chat. Would love to see any questions and answer any questions that you guys have pertaining to the Pittsburgh Penguins, the Stanley Cup playoffs, the offseason coming up as well. So if you have a question, drop it in there. I'll talk for a couple more minutes. And if there's no more questions, I'm going to take an early day and I'm going to go sit back and enjoy the nice day outside. But I think the biggest thing today that I wanted to touch on was that Valtteri Puustinen discussion, just simply because it's going to be a really huge opportunity for him to go out there and make sure that he is somebody that stays high on the radar. It's also important because, there's a chance he gets lost in the shuffle. You look at Kyle Dubas saying that he wants to get younger going into next season, and a big part of that is going to be some of the guys that he just brought in. Vasily Ponomarev. It's going to be Ville Koivunen. It's going to potentially be a Tristan Brose coming up from the NCAA ranks next season. It's going to potentially be somebody else that has been put in the comment section here, and I'll talk about in a minute, which is Braden Yeager. We'll talk about him in a second. So with all these young players coming up, and I already mentioned it, 3 or 4 of those top 6 roles are already taken. Where does Valtteri Puustinen sit? This is an opportunity for him to separate himself a little bit, to leave a lasting impression on Kyle Dubas, and to put himself in a solid position to carry some momentum from this season through the summer and into training camp next year. Let's look at this questions we got here. Team Crusade starts us off with, do you think Utah would accept Graves for just a 7th round pick? I'm not sure if they would. Obviously, they're a team that would be on the radar for Ryan Graves if there ever was a team. I find it hard to believe that any team's going to take that easily. I think it's going to have to be a long negotiation, but I also don't know if the Penguins, as I've mentioned, are going to end up moving Ryan Graves. They might want to give him a second season. They might believe in his ability as to what they saw when they signed him versus what they saw this past season. So we'll have to see what happens with that. But I think that Utah is certainly interesting. They don't have a lot of defensemen signed. They need to make the cap floor. It's a year where they're not trying to go out there and win a Stanley Cup. It's not a year that they're going to really try to compete. I mean, as much as they can, but it's not a year that they're going to go for it. The only problem with that is, even for a 7th round pick, you're swallowing 5 years. So that eats into whatever contention window, if you're Utah, that you're hoping to have. So I'm not sure that Utah is the best fit. I know there is one team that my colleague, Nick Horwat, floated out there, and that's a team that is going to need to make some changes, even if they're going to continue to want to try to challenge for a cup. And that's the Toronto Maple Leafs. I don't know. I gotta read his article. He just put it out. I wasn't able to read it before jumping on here, But I find it very interesting that he floated out the idea of the Toronto Maple Leafs maybe being a little bit desperate to change things up and trying to add some defense. I'm not sure adding a Ryan Graves is really the best option for them there, but that is certainly an idea. Justin asks, and this is the one I alluded to, is Brayden Yager going to be NHL ready next season? That I'm not exactly, I'm not going to put a 100% marker on it, but Brayden Yager has had a phenomenal season at the WHL level with the Moose Jaw Warriors. He has a huge Game 7 coming up here in about 4 hours in the Eastern Conference Finals, the WHL playoffs. 20 points in 15 games. He's been great. And at that level, I'm not sure what else he has to prove. He's proven to be a good 200-foot center. He's proven to be a good 200-foot winger. He's proven that he still has the scoring chops. He's proven that he can be a playmaker, setting career highs in goals and assists this year. So I'm not very sure what else he has to prove at that level. The only problem is he only has 3 technically full seasons of WHL experience, and he's not going to be 20 years old before the end of this year. So he cannot play at the American Hockey League level next year. So the question is going to be, is he NHL ready? That's the question that Kyle Dubas is going to have to ask and going to have to decipher as the season begins, because it's either NHL or WHL. And if you bring him up for that 9-game tryout stint and then send him down, you can't bring him up again until the end of the WHL season. So that's going to be a huge question in training camp. Is he able to surpass the names that I said before? Ponomarev, Koivunen, Puustinen. And at this point, when you only have that 9-game sample size, maybe you do give him that opportunity. And if he looks like he's ready to stick, you push past the 10-game, and that kills a year of the ELC that he has yet to sign as well. I would expect that comes at some point this summer. But the question is going to be, what does he look like in camp? And that's when you're going to decipher whether or not he's going to be NHL ready. I'd love to see him get an opportunity to play on some lines with some NHL caliber players. Get him some time with a Michael Bunting. Get him some time with a Brian Rust. See how that meshes. And if you want to move him to wing, get him some time with an Evgeny Malkin maybe. Get him some time with a Lars Eller. How does he mesh with these NHL talents, and how does he look in preseason? And like I mentioned, I would put a opportunity of them using that first 9 games of the season next year to test out Brayden Yager as a very interesting possibility. I wouldn't say it's likely, because we have to see how these other young players perform. There's a big crop of young players that are going to be battling for those spots, but I think the Penguins want to see what they have in Brayden Yager. He's certainly the most exciting prospect the Penguins have had in a very long time. NHL ready, I'm not quite sure, but I'm not sure that there's very much that he has to prove left at the WHL level. We'll have to see what they do with that one. Evan says, contracts aside, would you choose Ned or Jari as the starting goaltender next season? I'm going to be completely honest. The more I look into what Nedeljkovic did this season, the less likely I am to want him as the starting goaltender next season. He is not a standalone starter. Yeah, he was able to get the Penguins some wins late in the season. Situational hockey, he did a great job. But at the end of the day, you look at a lot of those games and he took them on like a backup would. Backup mindset. Just give the team a chance to win. Now, with that said, Tristan Jarry didn't give the team a chance to win a lot late in the season. Not before he was benched, and not when he came back in those couple of times after he was benched. He didn't give them a chance to win late in the season the year prior, and he didn't give them a chance to win in a lot of the playoff games he's played. So that's not the easiest decision to make. The goaltending situation for the Penguins is not pretty. And I think looking at both of them, contracts aside, like you asked, Evan, I would still probably choose Tristan Jarry because I think the ceiling is higher. Now, has he been able to perform to that ceiling? Not a lot. Every once in a while he does, typically in November and December, but the ceiling is still higher with Tristan Jarry if you're looking at them just as the player and outside of the contract. So that's my answer on that one. If it's contracts aside, I'm going with the higher ceiling, and that one is Tristan Jarry. Interesting screen name here, but I love dogs, all of them, so I'm not going to call your dog any of those things, but that's your opinion and you can stick to it. Do you think the Penguins take a shot at one of Jake DeBrusk, Dakota Joshua, or maybe even, an Anthony Beauvillier? Jake DeBrusk is a name that has been connected to the Penguins time and time and time again, and he just always continued to go right back to the Boston Bruins. If he's truly leaving Boston this time, I would not be surprised to see the Penguins at the very least sniff around what he could potentially be as far as numbers wise and what it would take to get him on the Penguins. Dakota Joshua is an interesting name. I don't know if they're going to look to bring him in simply because I think he would take a spot away from one of these younger players that they want to give an opportunity for. But Anthony Beauvillier, I think, is in the same boat. Jake DeBrusk to me is the most polished of these three. But at the same time, you look at the speed and the skill of Anthony Beauvillier. At his best, he's been a good NHLer. At his worst, he has been, a reason that he plays on the Blackhawks and played on the Blackhawks for a large portion of this season. So of the three, I would say DeBrusk is the most likely. Outside of that, I'm not sure they would reach out to go to Joshua or Anthony Beauvillier on the open market here. Evan also asks, what kind of contract do you see Crosby signing? Another 8.7 or more for how many years? The years one is tough. I always envisioned him going 3 more years after this contract. 8.7 or more it's going to be more, right? The NHL salary cap has gone up a lot since Sidney Crosby signed that $8.7 million a year. And while, yes, he is the most, he's one of the most, if not the most, I can't say the most because I don't know every player's superstitions, but it'd be hard pressed to find a player more superstitious than Sidney Crosby. I just don't see him taking 8.7 again. I can see him signing maybe a 3-year, $30 million contract, which would be a $10 million AAV. That's, as of right now, what I'm thinking it's going to come in around for Sidney Crosby. But again, does he want to take a hometown discount because he's made a lot of money in his career and he wants to win another Stanley Cup? Perhaps. But I still think that $10 million for Sidney Crosby might be a hometown discount for at least the first year, probably the second year of that contract, and perhaps even the third year of that contract. Who knows when Sidney Crosby is going to fall off a cliff? I'm not going to be the one to put that on camera because I have honestly no idea. I'm not even going to speculate on that. So to me, 3 years, $10 million, that seems like a fair contract for Crosby, and that seems like a contract, well, not a fair contract. It seems like a contract that Crosby would sign to be fair to the Penguins and also get him a little bit more money and get him paid to be a little bit closer to what he's worth. Hemi Head says, how many players will the Penguins lose in the expansion? You've put in expansion talk a lot, and I understand why. The Penguins certainly screwed up the last expansion, and that's part of the reason that they're in the situation they're in, losing Jared McCann for practically nothing, losing Brandon Tanev in the expansion, and Ron Hextall handled that poorly. But as of right now, they haven't even announced an expansion. Utah is not an expansion team. They are just the Arizona Coyotes that moved. So they're not going to have an expansion draft there. So there's not going to be an expansion draft anytime in the next probably couple of years. They haven't even announced one. Now, is the NHL planning to expand? That's a question more for an Elliot Friedman or a Jeff Merrick. But based on what they've said, at some point or other, the Penguins are going to, or not the Penguins, the NHL is going to expand. I'm not concerned about that right now because honestly, it's probably not going to be in the next 3 seasons. And at that point, where the Penguins are now versus where they're going to be at in 3 seasons, that's going to be a discussion that changes over multiple times. But expansion talk is interesting. Fortunately, they don't have to worry about it with the Utah, whatever they're called, Blizzard, Yetis. Yetis would be good. I think that's where I want to go, either Yetis or Blizzard. But it also has to be a really good logo if you're going to be the Blizzard, because Avalanche and Blizzard seems to be a little too close. Justin asked, do you think Pittsburgh's going to trade up to a first-round pick if they don't get into the top 10? No, I don't, because I don't think they're going to give up what it takes to get into the first round. The NHL, unfortunately, is not like the NFL. The draft is not as entertaining. Therefore, there's not as many picks, or there's not as many trades. Not picks, trades. And I don't think the Penguins are going to be interested in trading up just to get into the first round. I think they'll stick put. They'll take their selections and see what they end up doing with them. I don't think they'll trade back up into it, but like I mentioned earlier, there's a chance that they do end up with a first round pick. And that's if Carolina makes it all the way to the Stanley Cup final. They move up to 31st or 32nd. Justin also says, first looks on Tristan Brose and Ville Koivunen. The AHL games, I wish they would have played a little bit more than 2. Koivunen is a guy that had been lighting it up over in, I believe, Finland all season long. He scored a goal in his AHL debut with the Penguins. Obviously, he had played in the AHL with the Carolina Hurricanes organization. I thought he looked pretty good with Poulin for the small sample size that I saw him. And as far as Tristan Brose is concerned, again, small sample size at a different level that he'd been playing at all year. So I think both of them likely end up playing. Well, I mean, Bro's obviously playing in North America. Both of them likely end up playing at the very least at the American Hockey League next year. And I think of the two, Koivunen has a chance to make it to the NHL if he impresses in camp and again over those other players that I've already mentioned. Team Crusade asks, who would you ship off this offseason? I was thinking Smith, Jari, Nieto, Achari, and Graves. Riley Smith is the big name. 1 year left at $5 million. That shouldn't be too difficult of a contract to move, especially with the salary cap going up and his prior experience and his prior performance. I just don't think it fit in Pittsburgh, and I don't think it's going to fit in Pittsburgh next season. I mean, they brought him in. The big thing that he brought in was a little bit better rush, offense, and it happened early in the season, and then it just flew away. It evaporated. It was gone. And whenever that was gone, Riley Smith was a non-factor for large portions of the season for the Penguins. So I would agree with Smith. Jari, I would try to. I mentioned this on Friday's episode. I would try to go with an almost entirely new goaltending tandem. I would bring up maybe a Blomqvist, but if you're doing that, I would bring in Linus Ullmark. But to do that, of course, you have to get rid of Tristan Jari. So I would try to. I'm not sure the Penguins will. Matt Nieto is an interesting name. Horwat and I looked up what his buyout would be. Now, I understand Kyle Dubas mentioned that he doesn't like to do buyouts, but with 1 year left at, I believe, $800,000 or something of that sort, the buyout would be 2 years at $300,000. Those are pennies. Those are pennies. And if Matt Nieto is going to block a younger player, I don't think the Penguins, obviously, initially they would try to trade him, but if they're not able to trade him, I would buy him out if possible. Now, again, the buyout window is early. It's right before free agency, and then the second one opens up if you have somebody that's an RFA end up taking you to what's the word I'm looking for? If they go to arbitration, I'm not sure any of the RFAs are going to go to arbitration with the Pittsburgh Penguins, so they're going to have one opportunity. And if you can't trade Nieto, I would use it to buy him out. Achari's an interesting one. I don't think that they should get rid of Achari. He didn't have a great season. He's not going to have a great offensive season, but also I don't think he was in his best position. His best position's on the wing. Maybe that inspires a little bit more offense, but you also still need guys that are going to be physical in the bottom six. Achari brings that. Guys that are going to block shots. Achari brings that. And guys that are going to kill penalties. Achari brings that. That's the trifecta of a fourth line winger. And that's what I think they'll use him as next season. Obviously, signing him to a 3-year deal, and he didn't perform poorly, so I don't know why they would move away from him now. Graves, talked about him a little bit. It's a long contract to try to saddle on somebody else. And not only you're not going to get anything back, you might have to pay to offload it. And I'm not sure Kyle Dubas is interested in doing that. And like I also mentioned, he might want to just try and give Ryan Graves a second year to see if he can bounce back and be closer to the guy that he was in New Jersey, closer to the guy that he was in Colorado, and maybe playing him with a guy like Jack St. Ivany will help get him there. We'll have to see. Hemihead says, I'd ship off P.O. Joseph. I would tend to agree. Obviously, last week it was interesting. I believe it was Josh Yohe who wrote in The Athletic that the Penguins loved what they saw, not loved, but liked what they saw from P.O. Joseph late in the season and think that he's somebody that can play with Chris Letang and that could help the top four kind of be settled next season. So you're not flip-flopping Marcus Pettersson between Karlsson and Letang, just letting him play on that top pairing with Erik Karlsson and letting Chris Letang, a healthy, hopefully, Chris Letang, play with P.O. Joseph. I think the Penguins need somebody a little bit more stout in front of their own net. I think they need somebody a little bit more steady defensively than P.O. Joseph, but we'll have to wait and see what they end up doing with him. His contract is also up for renewal. I also love my dog, but he's deaf, so he can't hear when I insult him. My dog, if you're not watching this and you're listening to this on the podcast feed, this person's name on YouTube is My Dog is Fat and Ugly, and said my dog is deaf, so he can't hear when I insult him. I'd say the same thing. My cats aren't deaf. I insult them, but I also just hope they don't speak English. Justin asks, is there a chance Pittsburgh signs a big name free agent? I'm not exactly sure. I don't think. I would say that there's always a chance because Kyle Dubas needs to make a lot of changes, and if that happens and he's able to clear out a bunch of space, then he can. But as of right now, there's not a lot of space for the Penguins, and I think that they have way too many holes to be big game hunting in free agency, especially for a free agent crop that is not that enticing. I mean, Jake Gensel is going to be the top name there, but do you really want to pay Jake Gensel $10.5, $11 million a year, specifically if he's asking for a 7-year contract? I wouldn't do that if I was the Penguins. I don't think that is conducive to what they want to do. Yeah, you bring in a guy that is the best winger Crosby's ever had, but you're really handcuffing your team going down the line here, especially when Gensel's already at the age of 30. So we'll have to wait and see what happens with that. Any other questions we have here? What would a realistic trade package be for Linus Ullmark? That one's interesting because the Bruins tried to trade him this year at the trade deadline. He nixed the trade. Now, the rumors are that the trade was going to be him to New Jersey. He wanted to stay in Boston, but with Jeremy Swayman's contract up and in need of a renewal, him performing again for a second straight season very well, taking over the starting role from a guy in Ullmark who won the Vezina last year, and Swayman now being the guy that's leading them in the postseason to, we'll see, a 1-0 series lead in the second round against a very good Florida Panthers team. For a large portion of that first round, he was the best goaltender in the Stanley Cup playoffs. I'm not sure what it would take because he holds a lot of power with that modified no trade clause, and he already showed that he's going to use it. I don't think it'd be a first round pick, but I think it would take a second round pick and probably one of those good prospects. Are you willing to give that away for a goaltender? I would say yes, but at the same time, it depends on what you had to give up to get rid of Tristan Jarry, because I don't think the Penguins can afford to have $5+ million of Tristan Jarry. And what I believe, let me look it up here, what I believe is a $5 million deal for Linus Ullmark. I know he's heading into his last season, and he is making $5 million with a modified no trade clause that goes from 16 to 15 this summer. So maybe that helps the Penguins, and maybe it doesn't. But at the same time, that would be the best player right now that's potentially going to be on the move that the Penguins could get between the pipes. I would say it's at least going to be a second and probably a decent prospect, if not a pretty solid NHL player. Is Puustinen a name that goes up in that conversation? Is, one of the younger guys' names that go up in that conversation? If I'm the Penguins, my untouchables there, probably, or definitely Braden Yeager. Probably Owen Pickering. He had a decent season for the Swift Current Broncos. He's somebody that's going to probably make the jump to the American Hockey League level because he's surpassed that 20 years old age range. Probably you're looking at maybe moving one of the guys that you got in the Gensel trade, or maybe, I don't know if they'd include a Tristan Bras because he's coming off a really good year. His value is at an all-time high. I'm not sure if the Penguins would be willing to deal him, but I'm sure that would be a name that would come up if they're looking to get one of the top prospects. Off-topic question, but is that a playoff mustache? It's awesome, by the way. Appreciate you. It is not a playoff mustache. I had a beard for the longest time here the last couple of months. I was going to a wedding over the weekend, and the beard was a little bit not nice enough for wedding attire, so I shaved it down to a mustache. Glad you enjoy it here. Evan asks, not related to anything current, but who would be your next choice for captain in Pittsburgh? Assuming Sid, Letang, and Malkin are all retired, I would say Rust if he's still here. That is 100% the name to watch. If Rust is still here, which Crosby might play 4 more seasons, he might play more, and at that point, Brian Rust is in his mid-30s. He might be close to retiring, but maybe go Brian Rust. Maybe you look at what some teams do and you don't put a captain for a couple of years, because I think the only other name that I would think of for the Penguins captaincy is potentially Braden Yeager. But again, we have no idea what he looks like at the National Hockey League level. We have no idea if he's somebody that could come in and be the leader of a team on the ice. Off the ice, he's, for the past 2 seasons, won the most gentlemanly award of the WHL, which is a good sign for his leadership qualities. He is somebody who has been leading that Moose Jaw Warriors team this year, not just in the regular season, but now in the postseason. While he's not the points leader, He seems to be one of the talkative leaders, one of the locker room leaders, and somebody that's always seemingly in their post-game picture that they do with the fighter jet helmet. So, I would think that if it's not Brian Rust, if he's too close to the end of his career, they wait and they see if not Tristan Brose, excuse me, if Braden Yeager ends up being that guy. But outside of that, it's a hard question to answer because Sidney Crosby can play into his 40s. The way that he's been going, he could play into his 40s. Whether he wants to do that, whether he's capable of doing that, that remains to be seen. But I would say you're spot on with the Brian Rust as far as the people that are on the roster now. And I would put a little bit of love towards Braden Yeager as potentially being that type of player. Let's look at what other questions we have here. Hope the Pens reach out to David Carl. Not sure he would leave Denver for an assistant coaching job or make him an associate coach and let Sullivan ride off in 1 to 2 years with the in-house guy in place. David Carl would be a dream hire for the Penguins if Mike Sullivan's time in Pittsburgh is close to ending. Mike Sullivan's time in Pittsburgh, I'm not sure if it's close to ending. And I also agree with you, Kent. David Carl is not coming for an assistant coach job. He's not coming for associate coach job. He's not coming for the head coaching gig at the Wilkes-Barre Scranton Penguins. If those are the jobs that the Penguins offer him, he's probably going back to Denver. He always said that what he wanted to do was get Denver to be the first team to double-digit national championships. He accomplished that this season with Tristan Brose in tow. He got to 10 with Denver, but I think that he is a guy that if he's going to make the jump to the NHL, it's going to be to go right into a head coaching gig. There's a lot of opportunity there for him this year. Maybe he gets into the coaching carousel. He's certainly going to be one of the big names to watch. I just don't think the Penguins have what he wants, and they can't offer him what he wants. And especially coming into a role where Mike Sullivan is so ingrained as the head coach. He has the backing of the ownership. He has the backing of the general manager. And really, he's survived this long at this point without being canned. He has the backing of, I also should mention, he has the backing of the 3-star players that only want to play for him. That's what Josh Yohe put in The Athletic. I believe it was earlier today. It's going to be hard to wrestle a guy like David Carl away from Denver for that type of opportunity. Kent Hedrick also says, Jari to the Devils for Holtz and Ball. I wouldn't hate that. I think New Jersey would. I'm not sure Jari is the guy that they're looking for, but again, who knows what his value is outside of Pittsburgh. Hemi Head says Carlson for captain. No, not going to happen. Erik Karlsson's 33 years old. He's been a captain before, obviously, of the Ottawa Senators. I had to think for a second there. But I don't think that he's going to get a letter as long as Crosby, Malkin, and Letang are on the roster. Now, Malkin, maybe he walks away in 2 years, and Karlsson has, I believe, 1 year left on his contract after that. Maybe he gets an A at that point, but I don't think Karlsson's going to outlast Sidney Crosby, certainly not with the Penguins, and I don't think that anybody's supplanting Crosby anytime soon. My dog also asks, what do you think it takes for Sullivan to get fired? Next year is going to be interesting because at this point, there's no more scapegoats. And if the Penguins go into next year again and have the same exact issues with what I presume is going to be a very different team, right? The Penguins the last couple of seasons have experienced a lot of turnover and then gone into the season. They had to get their chemistry right, and then it just never clicked. The big offseason 2 years ago with Ron Hextall at the helm, flipping over the defense, the Matheson trade, the Ty Smith for John Marino trade, all the moves that were made that offseason. Then you go back to this past offseason, the huge trade with Karlsson, which also got rid of 3 or 4 actual NHL names, bringing in Achari, bringing in Nieto. This offseason, the one name we already know is going to be gone is Jeff Carter. That's a big name in the locker room. Maybe not a big name on the ice, even though he had 10-plus goals. But there's going to be a lot of turnover. So next year's going to be interesting. If he struggles out of the gate and it looks the same with a third different team, that's when I think the heat starts to get turned up a little bit. And also, I think a big part of this is going to be who gets hired to be the assistant coach to take Todd Reirden's spot. And more importantly, who gets hired down at the AHL level. Kyle Dubas has only ever hired one National Hockey League coach. His name is Sheldon Keefe. He may be fired by the Toronto Maple Leafs. And the way that he ended up going in is he was hired as the head coach at the AHL level. And then he supplanted Mike Babcock and got called up essentially the same way that Mike Sullivan did. Who's hired in those positions? Because that, I think, tells you a lot about where the Penguins are with Mike Sullivan going into next season. Obviously, he's safe this offseason. And from what Josh Yohe of The Athletic wrote, he's safe until he doesn't want to be safe anymore. But if the Penguins change the lineup again and still struggle again mightily out of the gate like they did the last 2 seasons, is Kyle Dubas going to be patient? Is FSG going to be patient? Or are they going to wait and see if he can dig them out of the hole? Because if he doesn't, that's a third wasted season of Sidney Crosby's career. And that's going to be a tough pill to swallow for the Penguins, for Dubas, and for the entire organization. So it's interesting. If the Penguins get into the top 10 of the draft, or the top 10, who would they draft? If they get into the top 10, they'd go at number 4 overall. I do know there's a lot of defensemen that are high in the draft, but I have not done nearly enough draft research to be able to give you that answer. In fact, should probably bring on a guy like Jacob Puntori, who works for Inside the Penguins. He is the draft and prospect guy. He would probably have a better idea, but again, very early in that process. If they get into the top 10, that's probably when we're all going to start looking into it. But as of right now, with a 1.5% chance, I haven't dove into prospects, so I can't give you an answer on that one yet, Justin, but I'll try to look a little bit closer into it, and maybe as the draft gets closer, we'll talk a little bit more about the draft. Let me look at everything else we have here. Heather says, scroll back up. Allmark exercises no trade earlier in the year. Would he come here? Boston has a 67.6 million in cap committed for next year. Swayman needs a new deal, as does Grzelcyk, DeBrusk, and JVR. Are they pressed for cap? I'm not sure if they're pressed for cap, but they're going to have to pay a lot of money to keep Swayman there. Do you really want to pay over $10 million for your goaltenders? I don't think. Most teams don't, unless they're getting a guy like a Sergei Bobrovsky, unless they're getting a guy like a Andrei Vasilevsky. So I'm not sure that that's going to end up being the way that they go, and they're going to prioritize goaltenders over some other holes that they have in their lineup. Braden asks, is Mitch Marner's time in Toronto done? Feel a Bunting, Malkin, Marner line, I'm assuming, would be deadly, but his attitude and accountability worries me. He is a very talented player, is Mitch Marner. He is a, most of the time, 90-plus point scorer. You would be silly if you wouldn't want a Mitch Marner. With that being said, there's a lot of smoke around him leaving Toronto. Would the Toronto Maple Leafs and the Pittsburgh Penguins be able to work out a deal? I'm not sure. Would Brad Treliving be able to work out a deal with Kyle Dubas in which one of them doesn't try to severely one-up the other and get frustrated and leave the negotiating table? I'm not sure. But if Mitch Marner is up for grabs going into the last year of his contract, I also don't know if he would get traded to a team that probably doesn't have too much interest in laying down a new deal right away. If you're the Penguins, do you make that move in a vacuum and bring him in for 1 year? Perhaps. But at the same time, he's going to want to go to a team that he can talk extension with. And do you really, if you're Kyle Dubas, want to negotiate extensions with Crosby and Marner in the same offseason? That would be a tough one. That would be a tough one, especially after trying to, negotiate out maybe a Tristan Jarry trade, negotiate out maybe a Ryan Graves trade. It's certainly going to be interesting. It is, but I'm not exactly sure. I think his time in Toronto is done, to answer your question. And yes, a Bunting, Malkin, Marner line would be electric. I'm not sure the fit in Pittsburgh is going to end up working out, to be completely honest. My dog asks, we only going to do a couple more here, but he asks, last question for me. If you could undo any Hextall era trade, what would it be? Easy. Anytime you give away a young right shot defenseman that can play really well with Marcus Pettersson, you bring him back. I would undo the John Marino trade. I would say also the Jared McCann trade, but at the same time, you look at what the Penguins have on defense right now. Yeah, Jared McCann went on to become a 40-goal scorer. I don't think he would have ever become that with the Pittsburgh Penguins. I don't think he would have been put in a situation like he is in Seattle to be able to be that player. John Marino was going to be a top 4 defenseman on the Penguins for a long time. He was coming off of a bad year, and one bad year was enough for Ron Hextall to execute that trade, but a Marino-Pettersson pairing would have been great to have this year. I'll tell you that much. So the first one that comes to mind is the Marino one. The McCann one, I think, also fits in there as well, because as a result of that, you lost both him and Brandon Tanev, and that really was detrimental to the Penguins' depth. Team Crusade says, can Mike Sullivan get traded? Is that even a thing? If so, what's his value? I'm not sure what the value would be because it has been a long time, but yes, he can technically be traded. Again, not sure what else is going to go into that, but it is possible. I don't think it's going to happen, but it's something that could happen potentially. Kent says, not sure if Knobloch will bring his own guys in this offseason. If so, the Pens need to at least talk to Glenn Galutzin. The power play has finished 9th, first, and third, and first and fourth, in his 6 years. I don't know anything about him, but that's certainly a name that now that you brought it up, I'm going to definitely look into. Last one we have here. Robert says he doesn't want Marner at all. Why would anyone want a guy who goes to sleep in the playoffs? I'll say this, Robert. Marner has not had a lot of playoff success. But I'll also say this. A lot of players on the Toronto Maple Leafs had not had a lot of playoff success. What does that look like if he goes to a different team? What does that look like if Mitch Marner's playing with a guy like Kenny Malkin? What does it look like if he's playing with a guy like Sidney Crosby? That much we don't know. And that's the risk you're willing to take. But at the same time, a 90-plus point scorer, if you're the Penguins, you haven't been in the playoffs the last 2 years. 90-plus points from Mitch Marner, somebody who can definitely replicate that going forward. You add that to your team if you can, if the deal works, if the shoe fits. Worry about the playoffs by getting into the playoffs first. So we'll have to wait and see what they do with that. But that's going to do it for this episode of Tip of the Ice-Burgh Live. Thank you to everybody for tuning into this live. We'll be back next Tuesday with a live, but in the meantime, we have shows going up every single day at Inside the Penguins on YouTube or anywhere you get your podcast from. We'll see you guys next time.